Okay, I guess this is maybe even part three. So, um, again, the whole idea was that we could set up an animation that would be a system, and then we could use simulation, right, to do something. So we animated some physics property. I'm just trying to riff on some of the various things that we could do here. So, if I wanted to maybe change the text here. Okay, so maybe I want to try something with break. So another little item. So in class we looked at the cloner, right? And the cloner is a way of making copies. We made a whole bunch of like a tiled grid, and the text object is a variation of this, right? Doing clones of letter form. So there's another cloning type, actually, that's fracturing. So this Voronoi is like a mathematical way of creating kind of a fractured pattern. It's like creating random points on a surface and then figuring out what those boundaries are. And so we can use this to actually do some nice things for us. So if I just take the text object, I moved pretty quickly there, and I put it inside the Voronoi. So anytime something's green over here in Cinema, it generally means that you put something inside of it, or as a child, right? So I drag and drop this on there, and it takes this object and it performs some stuff on it, right? So right now you can see that it's created this pattern, right? It's a color, and right now it's not going to do too much because the physics item, our little bullet rigid body, is over here on the text tag itself, but it's not on the fracture. So what I want it to do is not affect the individual letters like we had before. I want it to affect the individual fractures. So let's go ahead and press this. And what you can see, this kind of weird flashing that's going on, which is a problem we'll kind of fix here. But you will see that it basically works. So if you don't want to change anything, you could just try this. Now, you can see some of that went a little crazy. Keep in mind, before we set this up so that the letters would bounce a little bit, right? So we made the bounciness parameter pretty high. Let's go back here and let's just make the bounciness for the bullet physics object. Let's just make it, I think 5% is what it was. Let's make it 3%. 5% was the default. Right, and so you can see that the objects, they don't bounce around and they settle a little bit quicker on the surface. The flickering that we're seeing here is, you can still get this to work, right, as exactly as I showed you. But if we go into the Voronoi, it has a lot of parameters, but the source, it means where am I going to put random points on the surface? And if I click on what source, you can see that this is set at 20. I can make this 50. You can see, or I don't know, 250. You can see I get more fracture points. This is also going to start slowing down just because it has more fractures, and it has to keep calculating it because the object is moving, and so the way that it's creating those random points on the surface is a little problematic. The way it's being created through this uniform method, but it basically still works. There's some little problems in there just because of the way it's cycling through, but that would work just fine for what you want to do. You could also just delete that source and add a new one with a shader. So this is like putting a material on there. And again, this is a little more advanced, but if I go into the shader, I could use any number of shaders. I'm just going to use noise, which is just kind of a pattern. And I don't know, I'll tell it to be 250. Or let's even 100. Trying to remember how I set this up before. Oh yeah, and so if I click on, instead of this being sampled per volume, I want this to be as a shader. And then you can see I get lots of detail, and now I'll turn this down to maybe just 50. But the nice thing about this, because it's calculated based on the surface, not a volume, it will stick to the surface when these objects animate. So we will not see any of the flickering. Though this is, you can see it's chugging a little bit more. I'm doing screen capture while this is all happening. And I'll probably get a little more of like an explosion here. There's so many pieces. There's a lot of energy and overlap that's happening with all those little fractures. But you can see as we get close to frame 80 here in a second, we should see the physics start to take over now. Right? And there's going to be errors in this simulation. Probably some of the items might even fall through the floor just because of the nature of the calculations. We'd have to kind of up our settings here so we get a better calculation. But for our purposes, just learning what these things can do in a little animation, this is fine, right? Okay, so this is variation 2 on the idea of doing some simulation on our motion graphics object. So this is using the Voronoi fracture object. We got a little fancy in here, but I mean, some of this, even with the default, right, we were able to get that to work without having to add a custom shader or anything like that. But okay, I'll think of maybe one or two more that I could show for people to check out.